Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we are doing just that, a deep dive into, well, the complex reality of poverty. We're using a stack of source material that one of you actually sent in.
Which is fantastic. Always good to tackle topics our listeners are engaged with.
Absolutely. And our mission today is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge, the key insights from this source material.
Kind of a shortcut, yeah, to get you well informed on what poverty actually is, how it's measured.
Its effects, which are pretty far-reaching, how people are trying to address it around the world.
And crucially, the different ideas about, where it comes from, the causes, and the ethics around it.
Right. And the main source we have it's a really comprehensive overview. Lots of facts, figures, different perspectives packed in there.
So we'll navigate through it together.
Exactly. We'll highlight the key definitions, maybe some surprising facts, different viewpoints, just to help you grasp what's most important.
Okay. Where do we start?
Okay, let's unpack this, starting right at the basics. What is poverty?
Absolutely. Poverty is one of those words we hear all the time. It affects billions, literally billions of people.
Yeah.
But its meaning, well, it gets surprisingly layered once you start looking closely at how different organizations and these sources define it.
Right. And the source material actually starts by tracing the word itself back to Old French pauvreté, from the Latin pauper, meaning poor.
Simple enough on the surface?
Seems simple, but then the definitions, they reveal a much more complex picture.
They really do.
Yeah.
Generally, poverty is described as a lack or scarcity of financial resources.
Yeah.
And essentials. Things you need for just a basic standard of living.
The basics.
But crucially, the source notes this isn't just about, say, individual bad luck or something. It has diverse environmental, legal, social, economic, political causes and effects. It creates this really intricate web.
An intricate web, yeah. And major global bodies like the United Nations and the World Bank, they offer definitions that really seem to emphasize that complexity.
Precisely. The UN sees poverty fundamentally as a denial of choices and opportunities.
Yeah.
A violation of human dignity.
Dignity, that's a powerful word there.
It is. It means lacking the basic capacity to participate effectively in society. Not having enough for essentials like food, clothes, or, access to a school or a clinic.
Okay.
But it also highlights the non-monetary stuff. Insecurity, powerlessness, exclusion, being more susceptible to violence, and often living in marginal environments without basics like clean water or sanitation.
Wow. So that UN definition, it makes it really clear it's about dignity and participation, not just, how much money is in your pocket.
Exactly. And the World Bank echoes this. They call it pronounced deprivation and well-being, again, across many dimensions.
Right.
Yes, low incomes are part of it. The inability to acquire basic goods and services for survival with dignity, that phrase again.
With dignity, yeah.
But they also include low levels of health and education, poor access to clean water and sanitation, inadequate physical security, a lack of voice.
Lack of voice, interesting.
And just insufficient capacity or opportunity to improve one's life. It's broad.
So it's really about a lack of overall well-being and opportunity, which brings us to a fascinating point from the source about how poverty is actually measured. There are two main approaches discussed.
That's right, yeah. Absolute poverty and relative poverty.
Okay.
Absolute poverty, sometimes called extreme or abject poverty, refers to a fixed standard. It's meant to be consistent over time and across countries.
A fixed line.
A fixed line, exactly. It's about severe deprivation of basic human needs: food, water, sanitation, health, shelter, education, information. The real fundamentals.
Okay.
And this depends on income, yes, but also crucially on access to essential services. The source mentions having an income below a specific line needed to buy these basics is sometimes called primary poverty.
Okay, so absolute is about meeting those undeniable basic survival needs no matter who lives next door.
Precisely. Relative poverty, on the other hand, is defined in relation to others in the same society at the same time.
Comparison.
It's all comparison. It means someone can't meet the minimum living standard compared to the general standard in that country. The European Union, for instance, primarily measures poverty using relative income lines. Eurostat compiles those.
That's a really important distinction then, survival versus sort of relative living standards compared to your peers in that place and time.
It makes a huge difference in the numbers, as we'll see. And the source introduces another interesting concept, maybe less commonly discussed: secondary poverty.
Secondary poverty, what's that?
This describes individuals who actually earn enough income to be above a defined poverty line.
Okay.
But whose spending habits on things considered non-essentials, like, say, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, drugs, effectively leave them without enough for their basic needs in practice.
That's fascinating. So it's not just the amount of money coming in, but how it's, well, managed or maybe mismanaged in some cases?
Exactly. The source even gives some historical context, noting how temperance movements, like among 18th, 19th century Methodists who rejected gambling and excessive drinking, helped members avoid this secondary poverty and actually build capital.
A compelling historical illustration of that point.
It really is.
So let's dive deeper into the numbers then, because the source material gives some specific figures for these absolute poverty lines, particularly from the World Bank.
Yes, the World Bank's International Poverty Line. It's probably the most cited one. It's been updated over the years, moving from, I think it was $1.08 back in the 90s.
Right.
Then $1.25 a day for a while, and the current one is $1.90 a day, set in 2015.
$1.90 a day?
And these figures are based on something called purchasing power parity, or PPP.
PPP, right.
What does that mean exactly?
It's basically trying to figure out what that amount of money can actually buy in different countries. It attempts to create a comparable standard, because a dollar buys more in some places than others.
Got it. Makes sense. The source also mentions moderate poverty, which is living below $2 or maybe $5 a day, and even ultra poverty, which is less than 54 cents a day. Just incredibly low.
That $1.90 a day number, though, it's the one you hear most often.
Yeah.
But the source material makes it really clear this is actually incredibly controversial.
It really highlights one of the most crucial points from this source material, I think. How we measure poverty fundamentally changes the scale of the problem we think we're looking at.
How so?
Well, that $1.90 a day figure, while it's a common benchmark, it's fiercely debated. Some argue it might even be too high for some contexts, but many, many more experts contend it's far, far too low.
Why is that difference so significant? Why does it matter so much if it's a $1.90 or, say, $5?
Because the national thresholds for what constitutes a basic living standard vary wildly. The source contrasts the U.S. poverty line. Back in 2010, it was about $15.15 a day per person for a family of four.
$15?
Compare that with India at the time, around $1 a day, and China at $1.55 a day. These are all on that PPP basis, trying to compare apples to apples.
Huge differences. Makes comparison hard.
It does. But more pointedly, critics argue that a truly realistic minimum for basic needs and things like achieving a normal life expectancy might actually be closer to $7.40 a day, or even $10 to $15 a day.
Wow. Okay, that changes the picture dramatically from the $1.90 figure.
It absolutely does. And if you use a higher threshold, the estimated number of people living in poverty just explodes. One estimate cited in this source suggests 4.3 billion people.
Billion, with a B.
Billion. That's 59% of the world's population living on less than $5 a day and unable to adequately meet their basic needs.
Wow, that's over half the planet living below that $5 threshold. That's staggering.
It is staggering. And the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Philip Alston, he's been very vocal about this. He's called the $1.90 line fundamentally flawed.
Strong words.
Very strong. And he suggests it leads to this kind of self-congratulatory triumphalism, claims of progress that maybe aren't telling the whole story. He states that nearly half the global population, 3.4 billion people, live on less than $5.50 a day.
3.4 billion.
And that number, he says, has barely moved since 1990. So how we define and measure poverty is just deeply intertwined with how we perceive the scale of the challenge and whether we think we're winning or losing the fight.
It really seems like the numbers themselves are a subject of intense debate. It depends entirely on where you draw that line and what you consider basic.
Exactly. And the source does remind us that measurement goes beyond just income. It also looks at access to those basic needs we mentioned earlier.
Right, like health, water.
Yeah. And there's some good news there, actually. Life expectancy has increased significantly in the developing world over the last few decades. Child mortality has decreased dramatically.
That's positive.
Definitely. And access to things like sufficient food energy, literacy, clean water, even electricity and basic consumer items, they've all shown positive trends overall.
Okay, so progress in some really fundamental areas, even while the income poverty numbers, depending on the threshold you use, remain staggeringly high.
Yes, it shows that material conditions have improved for many people globally. But the sources powerfully emphasize the social dimensions of poverty measurement, too.
Social dimensions? Like what?
Things like unequal social status,
Yeah.
inequitable relationships, social exclusion, dependency, diminished capacity. It's not just about what you have, but how you're treated and what you can do.
Okay.
The World Bank actually did this huge research project called Voices of the Poor listening directly to people experiencing poverty.
What did they find?
They identified key factors like abuse by people in power, disempowering institutions, being stuck in excluded locations, gender issues playing a huge role, lack of security, discrimination. It's a long list.
It really sounds like poverty isn't just a lack of money or things, but it's also a lack of power, a lack of opportunity, and maybe a lack of social standing.
That's a key takeaway from the source material, I think. It connects conditions of scarcity to how resources and power are distributed in society. It recognizes that poverty can stem from a diminished capability. That's a term from economist Amartya Sen, meaning the actual ability people have to live the kinds of lives they value.
So it's not just about income.
No. It's also lack of access to information, education, healthcare, social connections, what sociologists call social capital or political power. All these things limit your capabilities.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. The source material makes this powerful case that poverty isn't just a state of being, like a static condition.
No, not at all.
But it's a devastating cycle where the effects of poverty actually become the causes of more poverty. It creates this kind of self-perpetuating trap.
Exactly. A vicious cycle.
And this happens across individuals, communities, even whole nations. Let's explore some of those characteristics, those effects that become causes that are described in the source.
It's a crucial insight, yeah. The features of poverty are often the very things that perpetuate it. Take health, for instance. That's a big one.
Health.
The source highlights that poverty-related causes are significant contributors to global deaths. It estimates about a third of all deaths worldwide, maybe 18 million people a year, are linked to poverty.
A third? That's huge.
It's enormous. And people in developing nations, especially women and children, they bear the brunt of this. They're massively overrepresented in those figures.
And within health, the source calls out hunger and malnutrition specifically.
Absolutely. The World Health Organization calls hunger and malnutrition the single gravest threats to public health globally. And malnutrition is the biggest contributor to child mortality worldwide.
Just devastating for children.
Utterly. Estimates suggest over 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night. 1 billion.
It's hard to even comprehend that number.
It is. And the source links this to factors like increases in food prices. Remember the food riots in 2007?
Vaguely, yeah.
Also environmental issues like drought, the water crisis, soil degradation affecting agriculture. Apparently 40% of the world's agricultural land is seriously degraded.
40%.
Yeah. And it mentions Sustainable Development Goal 2, which aims to end hunger by 2030. But the point is, this isn't just a symptom. Hunger and poor health prevent people from working effectively, prevent kids from learning properly.
Which keeps them poor.
Exactly. It perpetuates the cycle.
That connection between environmental issues, food security, and hunger is really stark. What about mental health? Is that part of the cycle too?
Definitely. The source discusses how the constant stressors associated with low socioeconomic status, things like low income, yes, but also poor healthcare access, discrimination, exposure to crime.
That's it, stress.
All that constant stress is shown to negatively impact cognitive performance, particularly in children. It can potentially lead to slower cognitive development.
Right.
The WHO explicitly links what they call social determinants like income inequality, lack of education, unemployment, insecure housing, exposure to violence, directly to poor mental health outcomes.
So the sheer stress of living in poverty can actually impact brain function, especially for young kids whose brains are developing.
That's what the research presented in this source points to. Things like stable care from a caregiver, a predictable environment, emotional attunement, enrichment opportunities, these are all crucial for healthy child development, and they're often lacking or inconsistent in situations of deep poverty. The source even mentioned some older studies, like one from the 90s, where children in disadvantaged inner-city areas reported witnessing serious violence at alarming rates.
Just awful.
And there's this compelling study mentioned, the Great Smoky Mountains study. It followed families over time.
What did it find?
It found that when some families, due to external factors, experience a significant and unexpected increase in their income, the rates behavioral and emotional disorders in their children actually decreased. And positive personality traits, like conscientiousness and agreeableness, increased.
Wow. That study really brings home how financial stability, or the lack of it, can directly impact a child's psychological well-being and their whole development trajectory.
It's a powerful demonstration of the link.
Okay, let's move on to education. That's got to be another critical piece of this cycle.
Oh, absolutely.
Huh.
Research cited in the source consistently shows a high risk of educational underachievement for children from low-income backgrounds. And this often starts really early, even before formal schooling.
How so?
Well, school systems themselves, sometimes unintentionally, can be geared more towards children from more advantaged backgrounds. Their home experiences might align better with school expectations.
Right.
And children from poorer families face significantly higher risks of things like being held back a grade, being placed in special education programs, or ultimately dropping out of school altogether.
Are the dropout rates significantly different?
The source notes one finding that low-income kids are about 2.4 times more likely to drop out of high school than middle-income kids,
Right.
and over 10 times more likely than kids from high-income families. Huge disparities.
10 times. Environments described in the source as urban war zones must make learning incredibly difficult, too.
You'd imagine so. And there are other risk factors linked to low resources, like increased exposure to juvenile delinquency or higher rates of teen pregnancy, which can further hinder educational attainment.
It all connects.
It really does. Less access to health care means more school absences. Illnesses make it hard to focus even when they are in class. And there's that challenge mentioned earlier. If a child's home activities, preferences, or even just their mannerisms don't align well with the school's culture, it can create extra barriers.
And then, of course, lack of education severely limits future income potential.
Exactly. It completes that loop in the cycle. Poor education leads to poor job prospects, which leads back to poverty.
So health and education are clearly both effects and causes in the cycle. What about shelter? A basic need.
Yes, the right to housing is mentioned in the source, and things like higher density, lower cost housing can certainly help low-income families.
But there are challenges there, too.
Big ones. The source highlights the issue of the geographic concentration of poverty. There's a hypothesis mentioned from sociologist William Julius Wilson called the concentration and isolation hypothesis.
Concentration and isolation.
The idea is that as better-off residents move out of core neighborhoods, the poorest residents become concentrated and increasingly isolated from things like job networks, positive role models, supportive institutions. Basically, the resource is often found in more mixed-income areas.
And gentrification is often part of that conversation, isn't it?
It is, yeah. Gentrification, the process where wealthier people move into and renovate poorer, often aging neighborhoods can lead to rising rents and property values that end up displacing the original poor residents.
Right. Kicked out by rising costs.
Although the source does include a mention of a conflicting study suggesting that, perhaps counterintuitively, poor residents in gentrifying areas might actually move less often than poor residents in non-gentrifying areas. So the picture might be complex.
Interesting nuance.
But regardless of the gentrification debate, poverty significantly increases the risk of homelessness. That's undeniable.
Any numbers on that?
The source notes that slum dwellers make up about a third of the world's entire urban population, often living in conditions no better, sometimes worse, than rural poverty.
A third of city dwellers.
And there are estimates of over 100 million street children worldwide.
That's just heartbreaking. And the point made in the source about many children in orphanages actually having living relatives but being there primarily because of poverty, that's particularly poignant.
It is, and it suggests that sometimes aid directed toward supporting those relatives might be a more effective and cheaper solution than institutional care. Keeps families together.
Makes sense. Okay, another critical area where poverty impacts daily life is access to basic utilities like water, electricity.
Right. And it seems completely counterintuitive, but the source points out that the poor often end up paying more per unit for basic services like water.
More. How does that happen?
Well, access to reliable, affordable services like water, sanitation, energy, even telecommunications demonstrably helps reduce poverty. But getting that access is the problem.
Okay.
On water and sanitation specifically, the source mentions that as of 2012, 2.5 billion people lacked access to improved sanitation. 15% of the global population practiced open defecation.
Grim statistics.
Very. But there's a compelling positive example from Bangladesh mentioned. Providing simple, subsidized pit latrines to the very poorest households sparked a kind of cultural change. Other villagers saw the benefits and started building their own, leading to a dramatic drop in diarrheal diseases.
That shows the potential of really smart, targeted interventions, thinking about the local context.
Absolutely. But the source also notes the systemic issues that often prevent this. Formal water utility subsidies, for example, often end up benefiting wealthier, politically connected urban residents far more than the rural or slum-dwelling poor.
Why is that?
Often because the subsidies are on consumption, and the poor aren't connected to the network in the first place. Plus, utilities often recover very little of their costs, maybe only 30%, which gives them no incentive or funds to maintain the system or expand it to poorer areas.
So the poor are left out.
And they end up having to buy water from private vendors, often at huge markups. The source says 5 to 16 times the price paid by those with piped connections.
Incredible.
The source suggests that subsidies focused on the connection cost, rather than the water itself, might show more promise for reaching the poor.
Okay. And what about energy access? Electricity, cooking, fuel?
That's termed energy poverty, lacking access to modern energy services. The numbers are stark here, too. As of 2022, around 759 million people were without consistent electricity access.
Nearly 1 billion people.
And 2.6 billion people relied on inefficient cooking systems. Think open fires, basic stoves using wood or dung.
Which has health impacts, right? Indoor air pollution.
Huge health impacts, yes. But also major impacts on well-being, education. Kids can't study after dark, and particularly women's opportunities, as they often spend hours gathering firewood instead of pursuing education or income generation.
And fuel poverty is mentioned even in developed countries.
Yes, that term usually refers to households that cannot afford to adequately heat their homes. A different aspect, but still related to energy access and cost.
Right. What about financial services? Access to things like banking and credit.
Another major challenge. Access to credit for low-income individuals is often very limited. And when it is available, it can be predatory. Think loan sharks charging exorbitant interest rates.
It's exploiting desperation.
Exactly. The source highlights a perhaps surprising finding from research. Many poor people prioritize having a safe place to save their money even more than getting access to loans. Security over credit.
Interesting. What about things like microloans? They got a lot of attention.
Microloans, like those pioneered by Grameen Bank, are mentioned. They were intended to provide small loans to help people start businesses. But they've also faced criticism, according to the source, for sometimes charging very high interest rates themselves, generating hyper-profits for the lenders, and even being linked, controversially, to farmer suicides in some parts of India due to debt traps.
So a mixed picture on microloans.
It seems so. And a more fundamental issue is that many poor people are simply unbanked. Providing traditional bank accounts to people with very little money isn't seen as profitable for commercial banks.
Are there emerging alternatives for the unbanked?
Yes, the source mentions things like postal savings systems, which are common in some countries, and mobile banking networks using local agents are becoming huge, especially in Africa. They make sending and receiving money, like remittances, much safer and cheaper.
Mobile phones making a difference.
A big difference. The source also points to the future potential of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
CBDCs, what are those?
They're basically a digital form of a country's official currency, issued directly by the central bank. The idea is they could potentially reach unbanked populations very cost-effectively, maybe even using simple non-smartphones. Still early days, but potential there.
Okay. Finally, in this section on the characteristics or cycle of poverty, the source discusses prejudice and exploitation as both causes and effects.
Yes, this is where discrimination based on things like age, stereotypes, disability, gender, race, or caste significantly worsens poverty and traps people in it.
Oh, so?
Well, children, for instance, are noted as being more than twice as likely to live in poverty as adults globally. There's the concept of the feminization of poverty.
Right, I've heard that term.
It refers to the fact that women generally have higher rates of poverty than men, often linked to factors like lower pay, less access to resources, and the disproportionate burden of unpaid caregiving for children and elders.
And disability.
Disability and poverty often exist in a really vicious cycle. Poverty increases the risk of acquiring a disability through things like poor nutrition or dangerous working conditions. And having a disability can lead to poverty through discrimination in employment, education, and extra costs associated with the disability. Each makes the other worse.
A tough cycle to break. And there's a debate mentioned about cultural values versus economic opportunities as drivers of poverty.
Yes. While some theories historically have linked poverty to specific cultural values or behaviors within poor communities,
blaming the victim, essentially.
That's how critics see it. The evidence cited in the source suggests that changes in actual economic opportunities explain most of the movement into and out of poverty, rather than inherent cultural traits. The UN Special Rapporteur, Philip Alston, again, argues very strongly against simplistic, often caricatured narratives about the poor being lazy or scammers. He contends people are most often thrust into poverty by circumstances largely beyond their control, things like a major illness, acquiring a disability, job loss, divorce, simply earning unlivable wages, or facing systemic discrimination.
Right.
The source notes this historical tendency in many societies to distinguish between the deserving poor, or good poor, and the undeserving or bad poor. These judgments often mask the structural issues.
And exploitation is mentioned as a grim reality linked to this desperation.
A very grim reality. Experts cited note that extreme economic desperation can force people, disproportionately women and children, into highly exploitative situations. Things like human trafficking or engaging in prostitution simply as a means of survival.
Horrible choices to face.
Unimaginable. The source mentions an example from Zimbabwe where girls were reportedly trading sex just for food. Deteriorating economic conditions can also push children to abandon school to try and earn income, which puts them at much higher risk of exploitation.
And early marriage.
In some cultures, marrying off young daughters particularly is seen partly as an economic measure, reducing the number of mouths to feed or bringing in a bride price. Again, linking poverty to practices that limit girls' futures. This whole section really drives home how vulnerability isn't just a characteristic of poverty, it's a driver of poverty too.
It's a deeply interconnected web, then, of disadvantages, risks, lack of capabilities, a true cycle, which leads us logically to the next big section in the source material. How is poverty actually being addressed? What are the strategies and institutions involved?
Right. So after outlining the problem and its characteristics, the source dives into the solutions or attempted solutions. It broadly categorizes strategies into two main camps. Yeah. First, strategies aimed at increasing the supply of basic human needs, things like healthcare, education, clean water.
Okay, providing the essentials.
And second, strategies aimed at increasing people's personal income so they can purchase those needs themselves.
Makes sense. Supply versus demand, almost.
Kind of. And the force uses the example of building a road. A new road can do both, right? It can improve access for, say, mobile health clinics, increasing supply, and it can also help farmers get their goods to market more easily, increasing income.
Good example. And what about addressing that relative poverty we talked about earlier, the inequality aspect?
Exactly. That requires tackling inequality more directly. Strategies mentioned include things like progressive taxation, where higher earners pay a larger percentage, wealth taxes, reducing payroll taxes, which disproportionately affect lower earners, and policies aimed at increasing labor's overall share of national income compared to capital share.
And Oxfam is cited here.
Yes. Oxfam is cited, making the argument that extreme wealth concentration at the very top. They gave the example that billionaire wealth gains in just 1 year, 2017, could supposedly have ended extreme global poverty 7 times over, actually depresses overall economic activity, and is a fundamental part of the problem that needs addressing.
Quite a claim. Okay, let's look first at those strategies to increase the supply of basic needs. What role does technology and science play according to the source?
A potentially huge role. Advancements in science and technology, particularly in medicine and agriculture, can directly improve access to basic needs or make providing them cheaper.
Examples.
The source highlights the importance of knowing which interventions are most cost-effective. It uses the example of Sri Lanka dramatically reducing its maternal mortality rate, not necessarily through super high-tech means initially, but by focusing on proven cost-effective public health measures.
So smart spending.
Smart spending and simple, often low-tech things are noted as incredibly impactful and cheap. Basic water filters promoting hand washing with soap, micronutrient fortification like adding iodine to salt, huge health benefits for very little cost.
What about the state's role? Government funding for basic needs?
There's an argument presented in the source that certain basic needs, perhaps like universal health care or basic education, are best provided or at least funded by the state for reasons of efficiency and equity, to ensure everyone have access.
Okay.
But there's also a debate discussed about how the state should provide support. Is it better to subsidize the cost of essential goods like food or fuel? Or is it more efficient to just give people income grants or cash transfers and let them buy what they need?
Right. The subsidy versus cash debate. What does the source say?
It notes that broad subsidies on goods often end up benefiting wealthier people more than the poor. We talked about the Egypt fuel subsidy example.
Where the rich used most of it.
Exactly. Because they consume more fuel. So the money doesn't target the poor effectively. Cash transfers, theoretically, are better targeted.
But governments, especially in developing countries, face massive obstacles in funding these kinds of services, right? Even if they want to.
Huge obstacles. A major one highlighted is corruption and what are called illicit financial flows.
Illicit financial flows.
Yeah, basically money leaving the country illegally or unrecorded. Money intended for public services, whether it's government revenue from natural resources or even foreign aid, gets diverted, often siphoned off into overseas bank accounts, particularly in jurisdictions that maintain high levels of banking secrecy.
So money that should be building schools or hospitals just disappeared?
It vanishes. Illicit capital flight, often driven by corporations using tax avoidance schemes like transfer mispricing.
Transfer mispricing.
That's where, say, a multinational subsidiary in a poor country sells goods or services really cheaply to another subsidiary of the same company located in a tax haven. It shifts the profits out of the poor country, avoiding taxes there.
Clever, but harmful.
Very harmful. The source estimates that these illicit outflows from developing countries are enormous, potentially 10 times the amount they receive in foreign aid, and twice their total debt service payments.
10 times aid. That's incredible.
An African Union report estimated something like 30% of sub-Saharan Africa's entire GDP has been lost to tax havens over several decades.
Is there anything being done about that?
A proposed solution mentioned is forcing multinational corporations to do country-by-country reporting, publicly declaring their profits and taxes paid in every country they operate in, to increase transparency and make that kind of profit shifting harder.
Okay. What other obstacles to state funding are mentioned? Debt must be one.
Oh, massive. Developing countries' debt burdens severely constrain government spending on basic services. The source gives the example of Zambia back in 1997.
What happened there?
They were spending 40% of their national budget just on paying foreign debt. 40%. Only 7% was going to basic social services like primary health care and education.
40 versus 7%. Devastating priorities forced by debt.
Exactly. Debt relief initiatives have helped in some cases. Zambia, again, after receiving significant debt relief in 2005, was able to abolish healthcare fees, leading to huge increases in clinic attendance.
So relief can make a real difference.
It can. However, the source notes a complicating factor is that private creditors, like banks and bondholders, now hold a larger share of developing country debt compared to the past when it was mostly governments or institutions like the World Bank.
Why does that complicate things?
Because private creditors have what's called a fiduciary duty, a legal obligation to maximize returns for their investors. That can make them less willing or able to agree to debt restructuring or relief, compared to, say, government lenders who might consider broader factors.
Right. And the IMF and World Bank themselves often attach conditions to their loans, don't they?
Yes. Those are the famous structural adjustment policies or conditionalities, often involving things like austerity, cutting government spending, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and trade liberalization.
And sometimes controversial conditions.
Often very controversial. The source mentions the World Bank has historically pushed poor nations to eliminate subsidies, like for agricultural fertilizer, even if farmers couldn't possibly afford market prices.
Which could hurt food production.
Potentially, yes. Although the source also presents the counterexample of Malawi. They defied advice and reintroduced fertilizer and seed subsidies.
What happened?
They had record harvests. It transformed the country from being a recipient of food aid to actually exporting food. So those standard policy prescriptions don't always fit the local reality.
Interesting case. And the source mentions vulture funds in relation to debt. That sounds ominous.
It is pretty ominous. These are specialized investment funds, sometimes called distressed securities funds. They buy up the debt of very poor, often conflict-ridden nations on the secondary market for incredibly cheap prices, sometimes just pennies on the dollar.
Okay.
Then what? Then they aggressively sue the country, not for the small amount they paid, but for the full original face value of the debt, plus interest and penalties, often demanding 10, 20, even 100 times what they invested.
That seems predatory.
Highly predatory. They can pursue any assets the country might have abroad, or even try to seize payments made to other legitimate creditors, essentially holding the country hostage until they pay up. The source mentions the DRC Congo being targeted. Some jurisdictions, like the UK, Jersey, Isle of Man, have actually passed laws trying to ban their courts from being used for these kinds of claims against the poorest countries.
Wow. Okay, another obstacle mentioned for providing basic services is brain drain.
Yes, the emigration of skilled professionals, doctors, nurses, engineers, teachers from impoverished countries to wealthier ones.
Leaving a gap behind.
A huge gap. The source notes a statistic from 2004 that there were actually more Ethiopia-trained doctors practicing in the city of Chicago than in all of Ethiopia itself.
That's shocking. How can countries combat that?
Mitigating ideas mentioned include things like requiring graduates of publicly funded universities to perform compulsory government service for a few years, promoting medical tourism, attracting foreign patients to generate revenue that can help retain staff, and using telehealth technology.
Telehealth.
Yeah, using technology for remote consultations and diagnostics. The source gives the example of Alaska, where telehealth significantly reduced the need for costly patient travel from remote communities, and is credited with helping narrow the life expectancy gap, with the rest of the U.S. technology helping bridge distance.
Okay, let's shift gears now to the other side of the coin. Strategies focused on increasing people's personal income. Where does the source suggest is a key starting point?
Raising farm incomes is seen as absolutely central to anti-poverty efforts, according to the source, simply because the vast majority, about 3/4 of the world's poorest people, are involved in farming.
Makes sense to focus there, then.
And the research cited suggests that boosting the productivity and income of smallholder farmers is particularly effective. Growth in small farm productivity is estimated to be at least twice as effective at benefiting the poorest half of a country's population compared to growth in non-agricultural sectors.
So investing in small farms pays big dividends for poverty reduction. What about direct income grants, giving people cash?
Yes, that's discussed extensively. Concepts like a guaranteed minimum income or a universal basic income, UBI. The basic idea is providing everyone, or at least those below a certain level, with a regular sum of money sufficient to live on.
Is there evidence this works?
The source points to numerous studies of cash transfer programs, particularly in places like Ethiopia, Kenya, Malawi. These consistently show that giving cash directly to poor families effectively increases consumption, improves nutrition, boosts school enrollment, and encourages investment, often without reducing work incentives as some feared.
So the fears were unfounded.
Largely, according to the evidence presented. Proponents, including many economists cited in the source, argue that basic income or targeted cash transfers can actually be more efficient and effective at reducing poverty than things like minimum wage laws or traditional unemployment benefits, which often don't reach the very poorest or those outside the formal workforce.
And the source argues income grants are more efficient than those broad supply subsidies we talked about earlier.
Yes. For the reasons we discussed, subsidies on goods often benefit everyone, including the wealthy, and are poorly targeted. The Egypt fuel example again?
Right.
A 2008 study suggested that the amount of money India spent on its massive in-kind food subsidy program, the public distribution system, could theoretically have lifted all of India's poor out of poverty if it had simply been given to them as cash instead.
That's a powerful comparison.
Even famine relief models are increasingly shifting towards providing cash or vouchers to affected populations, allowing them to buy food from local markets, which also helps support local farmers rather than shipping in food aid from outside.
So lots of arguments for cash. What's the main challenge cited against doing this on a really large scale?
The biggest hurdles mentioned are practicality and scale, especially for governments in very poor countries with limited administrative capacity. How do you identify everyone? How do you deliver the cash securely and efficiently?
Logistics, basically.
Big logistical challenges. Those solutions are emerging. The source mentions things like using biometric identification, like iris scanning, which has been used in places like the DRC. India has made huge efforts to move its subsidies towards direct bank transfers using its digital ID system.
And CBDCs could help here too.
Potentially, yes. Central bank digital currencies are mentioned again as a possible future mechanism to deliver government payments like basic income directly and efficiently, even to people without traditional bank accounts.
Okay. What about economic freedoms? How does that relate to increasing income?
The source discusses how things like excessive regulation, bureaucracy, and corruption can stifle economic activity and job creation, disproportionately hurting the poor.
How so?
It contrasts the ease of starting a business in, say, Canada versus the difficulty and potential need for bribes in a place like Bolivia, according to one study. These barriers tend to favor large, established firms and act like a heavy tax on small businesses and informal entrepreneurs, where most poor people actually work or try to start things.
Right.
The significant poverty reduction seen in China, after it abandoned collective farming and allowed more market activity, and in India, after it dismantled its complex license Raj system of permits and regulations, are linked in the source to increases in economic freedoms.
So reducing barriers helps.
Reducing barriers, improving infrastructure like roads to give people better access to markets, these things help people generate more income. Yeah. And another huge factor mentioned is migration and remittances.
Money sent home by workers abroad.
Exactly. Remittances are a massive source of income for developing countries. The source notes that in 2010, the total amount of money sent home by migrants, $328 billion, was more than double the total amount of official foreign aid received, $130 billion.
Double the aid. Wow.
For some countries, it's a lifeline. India, for example, received more income from its diaspora in 2011, $52 billion, than it did from foreign direct investment. Migration is a major, often overlooked poverty reduction strategy for families.
Okay. Education and vocational training are often seen as absolutely key to breaking the poverty cycle by increasing earning potential. What does the source say?
Absolutely critical. Providing free, quality education, starting from early childhood all the way through tertiary level, college, university, for children from low-income backgrounds, is highlighted as crucial for improving job prospects and enabling social mobility.
And job training.
Job training specifically geared towards skills that are actually in demand in the local economy is also vital. Not just general education, but practical skills.
Are there cost-effective ways to boost education outcomes?
Yes. The source points to some surprisingly simple and cheap interventions that have proven highly effective. Things like regular deworming programs for school children. Intestinal worms are a huge problem that affects concentration and attendance.
Deworming. Really?
Huge impact for very low cost.
Well,
also providing free sanitary towels for adolescent girls to reduce absenteeism and implementing school feeding programs. These things improve health and keep kids in school learning.
simple but effective.
And conditional cash transfers, CCTs, are mentioned again here, like the famous Progressive Opportunities program in Mexico.
How do those work?
Families receive regular cash payments, but on the condition that their children attend school regularly and receive basic health checkups and vaccinations.
So cash with strings attached.
Essentially, yes, nudging behavior. And these programs have been rigorously evaluated and proven very effective in boosting both education and health outcomes for poor children, generally without discouraging parents from working.
Okay, so a whole range of strategies targeting supply and income. The source material also details the different types of institutions involved in all these anti-poverty efforts.
Right. It's not just governments. You have intergovernmental organizations like the United Nations and its various agencies, UNICEF, WHO, WFP, etc. You have the big multilateral development banks like the World Bank and regional ones like the Asian Development Bank or African Development Bank.
Yeah, okay.
Then there's a massive and incredibly diverse network of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, international ones, local ones, big, small, doing everything imaginable.
And increasingly for-profit companies.
Yes, that's noted too. For-profit institutions are playing a growing role, sometimes as contractors delivering aid or services, sometimes through impact investing or social enterprises.
And there are issues with foreign aid itself that are raised.
Yes, the effectiveness of aid is debated. The source notes problems like fragmentation, just too many different donor agencies, too many small projects, each with different procedures and reporting requirements, which can overwhelm the capacity of recipient governments and organizations.
Makes coordination difficult.
Very. Another issue highlighted is tied aid.
Tied aid.
That's when aid comes with the condition that the recipient country must spend the money on goods or services produced in the donor country.
So it benefits the donor's economy too.
Primarily, yes. The source gives the example of U.S. law often requiring food aid to be purchased from American farmers and shipped on American vessels, meaning a large chunk of the aid budget actually goes to U.S. producers and shippers, not directly to feeding hungry people as efficiently as possible. There's also a point made that domestic NGOs, those based within the country, often have better local knowledge and networks and might be more efficient, but they tend to receive a much smaller proportion of international funding compared to large international NGOs. Efforts to localize aid face challenges with accountability and capacity building.
And the source mentions this concept of a poverty industrial complex. What's that about?
It's a critical term, drawing a parallel to the military-industrial complex. It refers to the growing ecosystem of for-profit companies that are taking on roles previously held by government agencies or nonprofits in areas related to poverty alleviation, social services, and development aid.
Well, that's the concern there.
The core concern raised is that the introduction of a profit motive can sometimes conflict with the primary goal of effective service delivery to vulnerable populations. When profit becomes the main driver, corners might be cut, or services might be designed to maximize revenue rather than impact.
Any examples?
The source mentions aid funding increasingly flowing through for-profit consulting firms and contractors. It also cites some particularly concerning examples, like reports of private hospitals in some developing countries effectively imprisoning patients or even holding on to dead bodies until families pay outstanding bills. Instances where the profit motive seems to override basic ethics.
That's deeply disturbing. It's clearly a very complex ecosystem, then, of efforts, institutions, money flows, and significant challenges. The source brings this whole section on addressing poverty to a close by mentioning the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs.
Yes, specifically SDG Goal 1, which is the big one, end poverty in all its forms everywhere by the target date of 2030.
Ambitious goal. What does it entail?
Its specific targets include eradicating extreme poverty, defined at the time using the $1.25 day measure. Also, having the proportion of people living in poverty according to national definitions, which acknowledges the relative aspect.
Okay.
It also calls for implementing nationally appropriate social protection systems, safety nets, and ensuring that everyone, particularly the poor and vulnerable, has equal rights to economic resources, access to basic services, ownership and control over land, inheritance, natural resources, technology, financial services. It's comprehensive.
And achieving it.
The framework recognizes it requires integrated strategies at the national, regional, and international levels, a coordinated effort.
Okay, let's shift gears now for the final part of our deep dive. Looking at the perspectives presented in the source on the causes of poverty and also the ethical dimension surrounding it. The source highlights right away that ideas about causes are often highly ideological.
They really are. And this matters hugely, because different ideas about what causes poverty lead to fundamentally different proposed solutions. If you think it's individual failings, you propose one thing. If you think it's systemic structures, you propose something very different.
Right. The source notes some interesting data points here too, like social segregation correlating with lower income, but conversely, social connectedness to people from higher income levels being linked to better upward income mobility for poor kids.
Yeah, that research by Raj Chetty and others got a lot of attention. It suggests those social networks and bridges really matter for opportunity.
So what are the main schools of thought on the root causes of poverty, as laid out in the source?
It presents them very broadly. On one hand, you have the socialist tradition, which tends to see the roots of poverty fundamentally in problems of distribution, how the means of production, land, factories, capital are owned and controlled, benefiting a few individuals or classes rather than society as a whole.
And the solution from that perspective?
Generally involves some form of wealth redistribution, greater social ownership or control over the means of production, strengthening worker power, that sort of thing.
Okay. And the other main school mentioned?
The neoliberal school of thought. This perspective tends to believe the primary solution lies in creating conditions that are favorable for profitable private investment. Things like deregulation, privatization, free trade, low taxes. The idea is this will generate economic growth that eventually lifts everyone up.
Trickle-down economics, essentially.
That's a common term for it, yes. And the source points out the significant influence of neoliberal ideas, noting extensive funding over decades for think tanks promoting these views and the application of these policies in many heavily indebted countries, often as conditions attached to loans from institutions like the IMF and World Bank, as we discussed.
Right. How does governance fit into this picture of causes? Does good government reduce poverty?
Several studies cited in the source find a pretty strong link. Some show that economic growth is more effective at reducing poverty in countries that are well-governed. Others find a direct effect of good governance itself on poverty reduction, even independent of economic growth.
So governance matters beyond just growth?
It seems so, at least above a certain threshold level of governance quality. The source also specifically links the prevalence of dynastic politics, where political power stays within the same families for generations, to higher levels of poverty. The suggestion is these families may use their entrenched power primarily for self-enrichment through graft and bribery rather than broad-based development.
Okay. Now, there's also a fundamental historical debate presented in the source material, which seems really key. Was extreme poverty always the norm throughout human history?
This is a really fascinating and important point of contention that the source lays out. The mainstream economic history view, often associated with scholars like Martin Ravallion, Nicholas Kristof, Steven Pinker.
I've heard those names.
Their argument broadly is that, yes, extreme poverty was the normal condition for the vast majority of people throughout almost all of human history. And it was only really with the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, and global trade that the masses began to be lifted out of this widespread destitution.
So progress is relatively recent in the grand scheme of things.
That's the argument. Modernity brought alleviation.
But the source presents a challenging narrative to that mainstream view.
It does. It outlines arguments from academics like Dylan Sullivan and Jason Hickel, among others. They contend that widespread extreme poverty was not the historical norm. They argue it actually emerged or intensified during specific periods of social dislocation, like maybe late feudalism or the late Roman Empire.
Okay.
And then expanded dramatically and became entrenched on an unprecedented scale globally from about 1500 onwards, precisely because of the rise of colonialism and capitalism. They argue these systems actively caused mass impoverishment through processes like enclosure of common lands, dispossession, forced labor, resource extraction from colonies.
So the opposite conclusion, capitalism caused mass poverty.
That's their argument, that it created poverty on a scale never seen before by separating people from their means of subsistence and integrating them into an unequal global system. They would argue that the improvements seen in the 20th century were often linked to things like decolonization, the rise of socialist and labor movements pushing for redistribution and social safety nets. They acknowledge that absolute incomes have generally risen since the 1980s, but argue poverty persists under capitalism due to ongoing issues of unequal ownership control and appropriation of labor value.
A very different reading of history. Does the source include criticism of this challenging view?
Yes, it does. It notes critics, like Marion L. Tupy, who push back strongly, arguing that pre-industrial living standards were indeed generally miserable, citing evidence on life expectancy, malnutrition, violence, etc. They maintain that industrialization, technological progress, and global trade did bring about widespread alleviation, even if the process was uneven and had harsh aspects. They might even point out that Marx and Engels themselves acknowledged capitalism's power to vastly increase material production compared to previous systems.
So a real debate about the historical roots and nature of poverty. This really underscores how interpreting the past shapes our views on present-day causes and solutions.
Absolutely. Highly contested territory.
Okay, let's turn finally to the ethical dimensions of poverty that the source discusses. What perspectives are highlighted?
One major perspective framed is that poverty itself should be seen as a violation of fundamental human rights.
A rights issue, not just an economic one.
Exactly. Pointing to documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which includes the right to Social Security and an adequate standard of living. The argument is that allowing mass poverty to persist is a failure to uphold these basic rights.
Okay. There's also a strong connection made between poverty and environmentalism. How does that work?
The source presents the argument, central to the concept of environmental justice, that the poor disproportionately suffer the negative consequences of environmental degradation, which is often caused primarily by the activities of the rich.
Climate change being a prime example.
Climate change is the starkest example. The source notes the vast disparity in historical greenhouse gas emissions, the industrialized global north, responsible for the vast majority, yet developing countries in the global south are projected to experience something like 99% of the casualties resulting from climate change impacts, like droughts, floods, sea level rise.
A massive injustice.
Exactly. This fuels movements demanding climate justice. There's also a related debate mentioned. Does poverty cause environmental degradation, as suggested by the Brundtland Report, because desperate people may overexploit resources? Or can the poor actually be forces for environmental sustainability, sometimes called the environmentalism of the poor, protecting local resources they depend on?
Interesting debate.
But the overwhelming consensus highlighted is that climate change itself is projected to severely hinder future poverty reduction efforts. The World Bank and UN estimates cited suggest climate change could push over 100 million additional people into extreme poverty by 2030 through its impacts on agriculture, water availability, health, and displacement from coastal areas.
So climate change makes fighting poverty much harder.
Significantly harder. The source also touches briefly on the concept of green imperialism or green colonialism.
What's that?
This refers to situations where environmental conservation efforts, often driven by wealthy countries or international organizations, end up negatively impacting poor or indigenous communities in developing nations. For example, large tracts of land being set aside for conservation or carbon offsetting schemes, potentially displacing local people or restricting their traditional livelihoods, sometimes called fortress conservation.
So good intentions potentially having negative consequences for the poor.
That's the critique, yeah. Finding a balance is key.
Finally, the source touches on the role of spirituality and religion in relation to poverty. How is that viewed?
It notes that in some spiritual traditions, citing examples from Buddhism, Hinduism, like monks, Jainism, and certain Christian traditions that emphasize evangelical counsels like poverty, chastity, obedience, state of poverty, often chosen voluntarily, is seen as necessary or at least desirable for achieving certain spiritual, moral, or intellectual states. Detachment from material wealth is a virtue.
Voluntary poverty?
Yes. Examples mentioned include intentional communities like the Simple Way or the Bruderhof, or groups like the Amish, as well as individuals taking religious vows of poverty or traditions of mendicancy, relying on alms.
But the source also makes a distinction between this chosen voluntary poverty and the poverty that people are forced into.
Absolutely. It references Pope Benedict VI, who distinguished between the Christian ideal of the spirit of poverty, an internal disposition of detachment and humility, and the material poverty which is to be fought, meaning the unjust deprivation and destitution imposed on people.
So a crucial difference.
And the source notes that sometimes this voluntary poverty is undertaken out of solidarity with the involuntarily poor. Benedict VI is cited suggesting that adopting a simpler lifestyle oneself might be necessary to effectively fight the poverty that needs to be eliminated.
Okay, wow. We have certainly covered a vast landscape today.
We really have. It's a huge topic.
We've gone from the origins of the word poverty itself through its really diverse definitions and complex measurements,
Which give very different pictures of the scale of the problem.
to the profound, often cyclical characteristics we discussed impacting health, mental health, education, shelter, utilities, financial access, and susceptibility to prejudice and exploitation.
That cycle is so key to understanding persistence.
Then we looked at the huge range of strategies and institutions involved in trying to reduce poverty, targeting both the supply of basic needs and people's incomes.
And the significant challenges they face, like debt, corruption, illicit financial flows, brain drain, aid effectiveness issues.
Right. And finally, we delved into those competing, often ideological ideas about the root causes of poverty. Is it about distribution, economic freedom, governance, or deeper historical processes like colonialism and capitalism?
And the critical ethical dimensions, poverty as a human rights violation, the links to environmental and climate justice, and even spiritual perspectives.
It's crystal clear from all this that poverty isn't just one single, simple problem with an easy fix. It's this incredibly complex, interconnected web of factors, challenges, and perspectives.
Absolutely. And navigating this landscape, understanding these different layers and how they interact, seems crucial for really grasping the challenge and thinking constructively about solutions.
Well, hopefully this deep dive, this exploration through the source material, has provided you, our listener, with a more nuanced and well-rounded understanding of poverty. Maybe some specific facts, figures, and different viewpoints to hold on to.
Food for thought, definitely.
And we'll leave you with a final thought to mull over, something building on what we've discussed. We've seen how fundamentally different ways of measuring poverty can lead to vastly different numbers about who is poor, and we've heard starkly different ideas about its causes that point towards very different solutions. So the question for you is, how does understanding these different perspectives on measurement, on causes, on history, shape your own view on how best to address poverty in the world today? Welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we take your sources, unpack them, and really pull out the key insights so you can get informed fast.
And today we're diving into a really major one, Charles Baudelaire's Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil. It's infamous, groundbreaking poetry.
Absolutely. Our source here is a detailed exploration from Wikipedia. It covers the history, the structure, the themes, everything. It's often called, a foundational text of modern poetry.
It really is.
So our mission today is to journey through this collection, try to understand why it caused such a huge scandal back then, and why it still resonates today.
Yeah, it's got a lasting impact for sure.
Okay, let's jump right in. Where did this all start for Baudelaire? When did the first seeds of Les Fleurs du Mal get planted?
Well, the earliest poems that ended up in the collection, they actually go back quite a ways, mostly written between about 1840 and 1850.
A whole decade, basically.
Pretty much. We know some specific pieces like Une nuit que j'étais près d'une affreuse juive and Une dame créole were around as early as 1841.
So definitely not an overnight project, and I gather these poems started popping up in various places before the book itself came out.
Exactly. He published them individually in different reviews, literary ones like L'Artiste, but also, kind of surprisingly, Le Vin de l'Assassin, the assassin's wine that showed up in Les Chaux des Marchands de Vin.
An echo for wine merchants.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, kind of odd, right? And the actual title, Fleurs du Mal, that first appeared in 1855. It was used for 18 poems published in the Revue des Deux Mondes. It was actually suggested by a friend, Hippolyte Babou.
Interesting. So the title wasn't his initial idea, necessarily.
Seems like Babou nudged him. We also have Baudelaire's corrected printing proofs from early 57. They're a really important manuscript source showing how he was shaping the collection.
Right, seeing the process. So the first edition, the one that caused all the trouble, that was 1857.
That's the one. He sent the manuscript off to his publisher, Auguste Poulet-Molasses, in February 1857. He was actually aiming for exactly 100 poems.
A specific number. Why 100?
He called it a nombre d'or, a golden number, symbolizing perfection, I suppose. He actually had more poems written, but he cut some out for that first printing.
And apparently told his mother he was appalled by the horror he was about to inspire with it. So how many poems did make it into that first edition?
It ended up being 100 poems plus the introduction Au Lecteur to the reader, published June 21st, 1857. They printed about 1,300 copies.
Okay. And he dedicated it to Théophile Gautier, calling him a perfect magician of French letters, an impeccable poet. High praise indeed.
Very high praise.
But the reception, it wasn't universally positive, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was incredibly polarized. You had Gustave Bourdin, Le Figaro just tearing into it, called it a hospital open to all insanities, full of putridities of the heart.
Wow, putridities of the heart. That's memorable.
Definitely sticks with you. But then on the complete other side, you had Edouard Thierry writing in Le Moniteur Universel, which was the official government newspaper, mind you. And he hailed it as a masterpiece, even said it stood under the austere guarantee of Dante, linking it to, serious, important literature.
So love it or hate it right from the start. But it wasn't just critics arguing. The authorities got involved pretty quickly.
Very quickly. July 7th, barely 2 weeks after it came out, public security stepped in.
And seized the book.
Yep. Seized it for outrage to public morality and offense to religious morality. And the prosecutor, Ernest Pinard, he's kind of infamous because he was the same guy who'd prosecuted Flaubert's Madame Bovary just earlier that year.
So Pinard was really going after controversial books then. What was Baudelaire's defense?
His lawyer, Chez Desange, basically argued that Baudelaire wasn't trying to promote vice. He was trying to condemn it by showing how ugly it was, depicting evil to serve a moral purpose.
Did the court buy that?
Not entirely. They dropped the religious offense charge, but on August 21st, the day of the trial, they found Baudelaire and his editors guilty of outrage to public morality.
And the sentence?
Baudelaire got fined 300 francs, the editors 100, which was, a decent chunk of money back then, especially for a poet.
And part of the verdict was actual censorship, right? Banning poems.
Yes, exactly. The court ordered 6 specific poems to be suppressed. They said they contained gross realism, offensive to modesty, and obscene and immoral passages or expressions.
Which 6 were they?
Okay, let's see. They were les bijoux, the jewels,
Yes.
de l'été,
Yeah.
et celle qui est trop gaie, to the one who was too cheerful, lesbo, femme damnée, damned women, and les métamorphoses du vampire, the metamorphoses of the vampire.
And these specific poems, they were actually illegal in France for how long?
Almost a century. They stayed banned until 1949.
Incredible, nearly 100 years. How did other writers react at the time to the conviction and censorship?
Well, Gautier, the guy the book was dedicated to, he stayed publicly silent, which is maybe a bit surprising.
Yeah.
But others, like Jules Barbie d'Orville, expressed admiration for Baudelaire.
And Victor Hugo. He weighed in from exile, didn't he?
He did. Hugo sent Baudelaire this really famous letter praising the poems, saying they radiate and dazzle like stars. And after the conviction, he wrote that the book brought un frisson nouveau, a new shiver, to literature.
A new shiver. That phrase really stuck. It captures that sense of something totally new, maybe unsettling.
Absolutely. Became iconic.
What about that fine? Did Baudelaire end up paying the full 300 francs?
He actually appealed, wrote a letter to Empress Eugenie. He acknowledged the court's admirable courtesy, but basically pleaded poverty, the proverbial poverty of poets, as he put it.
And it worked.
It did. The Empress intervened, and the fine was reduced to just 50 francs.
So that first edition caused a massive storm. But the book didn't just disappear, it evolved, right? There were later editions.
Definitely. The 1861 edition is really significant. Baudelaire oversaw it himself, removed the 6 banned poems like he had to, but he added 32 new ones.
Wow, quite a few editions.
Yeah, brought the total up to 126 poems, plus the intro. And crucially, this edition added a whole new section, Tableau Parisien Scenes.
Ah, focusing on the city. That makes sense for Baudelaire.
Exactly. It became the second section, really highlighting his focus on modern urban life.
Were there other versions later on?
There was one in 1866 called Les Épaves, the Wrecks, or Flotsam, published in Belgium by Poulet Molasses, who was actually in debtor's prison there at the time.
Go away.
Yeah, and this collection included the 6 banned poems from 57, plus 16 other new ones. Publishing those banned poems, even in Belgium, got Poulet Molasses condemned again by a French court.
The legal trouble just followed him.
It seems so. And then there was a posthumous edition in 1868 after Baudelaire died. His mother supervised it, along with some literary friends. It had 151 poems total, but it didn't include those 6 censored poems from Les Épaves.
So the book had this really complicated, contested early life, different versions, censorship, editions. But eventually those banned poems were officially cleared, right?
They were, yeah. But it took a long time. There was an attempt back in 1929 to get the conviction overturned, but it failed because, believe it or not, French law didn't have a mechanism for revising convictions based on books and public morals back then.
So they literally had to change the law first.
Pretty much. They created a new legal procedure in 1946 specifically for this kind of thing. Then, the Société des gens de lettres, the Writers' Society, requested a revision for Les Fleurs du Mal.
And this time it worked.
Yes. France's highest court, the Cour de Cassation, annulled the 1857 conviction on May 31st, 1949, almost unanimously.
What was the court's reasoning almost a century later?
It's really interesting. They said the poems had no obscene or even coarse terms and were well within artistic freedom. They basically said the original 1857 court got it wrong by focusing only on a realistic interpretation and ignoring the symbolic meaning. They call that original judgment arbitrary and out of step with public and literary opinion.
Fascinating. The legal system finally catching up with the art, recognizing the symbolic depth. Okay, so that's the dramatic history. Let's shift focus now to the work itself, starting with that title, Les Fleurs du Mal, the Flowers of Evil.
The title is so important. He'd considered others earlier on, like Les Lesbiennes, the lesbians way back in 1845, and Le Limbo around 1848, but someone else used that title.
So Fleur du Mal came later, around 1855. He had that famous quote about it, didn't he?
Wow.
Something about extracting beauty from evil.
Yes, exactly. He said, it seemed pleasant to me to extract beauty from evil. He even described the book as essentially useless and absolutely innocent, made just to amuse myself and exercise my passionate taste for obstacle.
Which really flies in the face of poetry, having some, noble moral purpose. He's saying, I did it for the challenge, for fun.
Precisely. And the title embodies that challenge, Les Fleurs du Mal. Flowers beauty growing out of evil mal. It suggests beauty and goodness aren't automatically linked. That gives the artist immense freedom to explore, well, the dark side.
And the capitalization of mal evil with a capital E. That feels significant.
Definitely. It gives it a theological weight, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Makes you think of original sin, the tree of knowledge in Eden. It connects the whole project to this deep Christian ethical framework, even as he seems to be turning it inside out.
So it's not just bad flowers, it's flowers of evil.
Exactly. It's this core oxymoron. Evil and the search for the ideal, the beautiful. Those 4 little words kind of sum up the human condition, right? That tension between good and evil. And you see that same contradictory impulse in poem titles like The Sick Muse, The Joyful Dead Man, Sympathetic Horror.
Or even phrases like dirty perfumes.
Right. That's in Spleen Eye. It perfectly captures that blend of the repulsive and the attractive.
So the title sets us up for a complex ride. And speaking of the ride, the source really emphasizes the structure of the book. It wasn't just a random pile of poems.
Absolutely crucial. This isn't like older collections where poems are just grouped loosely. Les Fleurs du Mal is meticulously organized. It has a very precise design.
So the 1861 edition, the main one we study, has what, 6 sections?
6 main sections, yeah. Plus the intro, aux lectures. The sections are Splaine et Idéal, Splaine and Ideal, then the Added Tableau Parisien, Parisian scenes, then Le Vin, Wine, then Fleur du Mal, the section named after the book, Revolt, Revolt, and finally L'Amour, Death.
And these sections map out a kind of journey, a psychological or spiritual narrative.
Exactly. Baudelaire himself said the structure reflected his desire for asceticism, his search for the absolute. It takes the reader through a definite progression. It starts with Spleen et Idéal, that's the baseline. The poet's suffering, his disgust with the world, the spleen. That feeling demands some kind of escape or expiation, often framed in Christian terms of sin. It leads to withdrawal, but also this yearning for something better, the ideal.
Okay, so spleen is the problem, ideal is the goal, and the next sections are attempts to get there.
You got it. Tel Parisien, Le Vin, and the Fleur du Mal section, they represent different escape routes. Trying to find transcendence in the anonymity of the city, or through artificial means like wine and drugs, or through sensual pleasure and finding beauty in the traditionally ugly.
But these attempts, they don't ultimately work out, do they?
No, that's the tragedy of it. They all prove disappointing, maybe a brief moment of feeling good, but then it's followed by remorse, or even deeper despair.
And that failure leads where?
It leads to revolt, revolt. A rejection of this whole futile existence, a lashing out against God, even. And finally, that culminates in L'Amour, Death, the end point of the journey.
And Baudelaire himself stressed this structure was intentional.
He did. He wrote in a letter, "The only praise I ask for this book is that people recognize it's not just an album that has a beginning and an end." He really wanted it seen as a unified, structured whole.
That really changes how you read it. It's not just poems, it's a path. So let's quickly touch on what's in these sections. Spleen et Idéal is the biggest one.
By far, 85 poems. It explores that core tension, the despair, the feeling of time running out, death being certain, but also moments of trying to rise above it towards the ideal. These attempts often fail, leading to temporary escapes, like sleep or memory. The only thing that sometimes offers real access to the ideal is synesthesia, that blending of senses. The poem Correspondences is the absolute key text here, laying out that whole idea.
And then Tableaux Parisiens, the section he added later.
Right, 16 poems. This is the attempt to escape through observing Paris, the enormous Paris, this swarming city. Baudelaire becomes this painter of modern urban life. He even captures the destruction of the old city by Haussmann's renovations. The old Paris is no more, he writes. Despite all the noise, the deafening street, the rolling din of omnibuses, he finds moments of quiet contemplation there. Paris really permeates the whole collection.
And the short section, Le Vin, Wine.
Just 5 poems. Another escape route, artificial paradises, often set in the gritty parts of the city, the muddy labyrinth of the suburbs. Wine is presented almost like a muse, a source of poetry, something that can transform reality, bring gold, like in the soul of wine.
And the section actually called Fleur du Mal.
12 poems. Here, the escape attempt is finding beauty in ugliness, physical or moral, trying to defy the planes of boredom that way. This section also heavily features the figure of woman, in all her contradictory aspects, grandeur and misery.
Followed by the really short but explosive Revolt.
Yeah, only 3 poems, but wow. It's pure poetic rebellion.
Yeah.
Against God, specifically siding with Satan. Hugely provocative, especially given the political climate, Napoleon III and the Catholic Church being so intertwined. There's that line from Abel and Cain, race of Cain, rise to the sky and cast God upon the earth.
Just wow, direct challenge. And finally, L'Amour, Death.
The last 6 poems. It looks at death not just as an end, but maybe as a release, a consolation, a final voyage. Death that consoles. It explores how different people face it. And the last poem, Le Voyage, The Voyage, is the longest. It's got this really bold structure, intense symbolist imagery. You can really see it pointing towards poets like Rimbaud, who came later.
Okay, so that structure provides a powerful framework. Now let's dig into some of the big themes that run through the whole collection. Obviously, we have to start with the spleen.
Spleen is just.
Yeah.
It's fundamental. It's not just being sad. It's this deep, suffocating disgust with everything, this profound melancholy, and maybe worst of all, boredom ennui. He calls ennui the ugliest, most wicked vice, something that grows to the proportions of immortality.
Feels inescapable.
Totally. Here, the mud is made of our tears, he writes. And poetry itself often seems like this desperate fight against the spleen. You often see this pattern in his poems, a moment of uplift, trying to reach the ideal, and then crash, falling right back into the spleen.
And alongside spleen, there's death. Everywhere.
Oh, absolutely pervasive. A central obsession. Time, for Baudelaire, eats away life. There's this chilling sense of the self as already being a tomb. My soul is a tomb. He talks about death constantly, almost casually sometimes. The source mentions about 33 poems focused directly on it, and maybe 1 in 5 uses funeral-related words.
And he doesn't sanitize it, does he? He looks right at the physical decay.
Not at all. Un charogne, a carcass, is the famous example, incredibly graphic description of a rotting animal. He imagines himself as a joyful dead man, basically a living skeleton. He's always questioning what happens after death or if anything happens. The dream of a curious man, the voyage.
The source mentioned the sheer vocabulary he uses for it.
It's extensive. Agony, corpse, funeral, cemetery decomposition, charnel house, sarcophagus, worms. He lists body parts. He draws on mythology sticks, charon, and medieval ideas like the dance macabre, plus ghosts, specters, vampires. But often the final feeling is just néant, nothingness.
Which must have been quite shocking compared to more, say, romanticized views of death. What about woman? The source calls her ambivalent.
Deeply ambivalent. She's everywhere in the poems, but shown in such contradictory lights. Sometimes she's positive, a sister, a mother figure, reflecting his own very intense relationship with his mother. An old woman, a sensual lover, an unattainable beauty, even an angel.
But then there's the other side.
Oh yeah, she's often a victim of male desire or contempt, portrayed as unintelligent, a vile slave, or conversely, a tyrannical Circe, cruel, perverse, demonic. Sometimes even linked directly to death, which pulls on some really old misogynistic ideas. He wrote specific cycles of poems about his actual mistresses, like Jeanne Duval, Apollonie Sabatier, Marie d'Aubrun.
It's complex. Is he just showing societal views or his own internal conflict? Probably a bit of both, maybe?
Very likely. It's hard to untangle.
Okay, what about animals? The source picked out the cat and the serpent?
Yes, 2 recurring figures. His fascination with cats is pretty unique in French poetry at the time. 3 whole poems dedicated to them. He links cats to women, to the ideal, to that mystical idea of correspondences. Calls them fairies, gods, great sphinxes.
And the serpent, more traditionally evil.
Often, yes. It shows up in about 15 poems. Frequently, it stands for evil, just like in the Bible asp, viper linked to disgust, anger, suffering, malice. But, and this is classic Baudelaire, he also gives the serpent positive qualities, drawing on older, non-Christian traditions.
Like what?
Flexibility, elegance, strength, even wisdom, vital energy, cosmic harmony like the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail. So even the serpent isn't purely negative for him. That typical ambivalence again.
Right, always mixing things up. Now, a really big one, religious faith. The source says it's deeply rooted, but also deeply contradictory.
That's a perfect way to put it. Faith, specifically Christian faith, is all over this book. More than 50 poems touch on it. He talks about his Christian blood, calls himself a good Christian, maybe linked to his grandmother, whose name literally included dear God. He mentions God, Jesus, Mary, saints, Jesus.
Angels and devils, too.
Definitely. Angels appear, sometimes helpful, sometimes hostile, and the devil is constantly lurking, invoked directly a couple of times. Sin is this huge burden, immortal sin, and hell is a recurring image. He uses very specific Catholic language too: incense, confession, liturgy, organ music.
But it's not just Christianity, right?
No, he throws in references to Islam, Hinduism, specifically Ganesh, the elephant-headed god, and paganism. It's a real mix.
Okay, but the core contradiction is he uses all this Christian framework, but then seems to rebel against it.
Massively. That's the shocking part. While he uses the language of faith, even seems to accept suffering sometimes in a Christian way, he's also incredibly irreverent. Blasphemous, even. Poems like The Denial of St. Peter, Abel and Cain.
And the litanies of Satan.
Exactly. That's outright apostasy. So his relationship with faith is just incredibly complicated. He seems genuinely disgusted by sin, calls it the boring spectacle of immortal sin, but he doesn't seem to understand or accept God's plan. Maybe some Enlightenment skepticism from his father in there, too.
And his interest in things like pantheism, seeing spirit in nature, that wouldn't have sat well with the church either.
Not at all. Considered heretical. So the source concludes, yeah, he uses the framework, but he's absolutely not an exemplary Christian. He's using religion to explore the human condition, sin, rebellion, often turning its meaning upside down.
It's a battlefield, not a sanctuary. Okay, let's talk about a key concept for understanding his poetry: correspondences.
Right. This is central to how he tries to glimpse the ideal. Correspondences are these Mysterious connections or bridges he senses between the ordinary physical world and some kind of deeper spiritual reality or afterlife.
He lays this out in that famous sonnet, Correspondences.
Yes. He says humans wander through forests of symbols that we have to decipher. These symbols hint at a dark and profound unity, an expansion of infinite things. These moments of connection, of correspondence, they bridge the gap between the material and the spiritual.
And these connections work in different ways.
Two main ways. There's the horizontal kind, synesthesia, where senses blend together, like smells, colors, and sounds echoing each other. "Oh, mystical metamorphosis of all my senses melted into one," he writes. Then there's the vertical kind, where a physical sensation connects you upwards, as it were, to a spiritual idea, a past life, the afterlife.
This idea was huge for later poets, wasn't it?
Immensely influential. It really fueled the symbolist movement. This idea that the poet can access a deeper reality through symbols, understand the language of flowers and silent things, it comes partly from pantheism, this idea of spirit in everything.
What kind of things trigger these correspondences for him?
Various things. A mirror reflecting some other world, memory bringing back a lost golden age, physical beauty sparking a kind of platonic love. But especially sensations, smells, and sounds are huge for Baudelaire, and they can combine in synesthesia.
But knowing Baudelaire, there's a catch, right? This isn't a guaranteed path to bliss.
Exactly. Crucial point. It's deeply ambivalent. The magic isn't guaranteed. It can flip on him, become an alchemy of pain, dragging him right back down into spleen. The mirror shows disgust, not wonder. Memory brings regret. Beauty leads to guilt or frustration. Sensations become overwhelming.
So the same things that could offer escape can also trap him further.
Precisely. It really questions whether we can consistently connect with anything beyond the mundane or if we're just stuck.
Let's turn to the sea. Another major presence, and again, ambivalent.
Very much so. The sea fascinated him, the ocean where splendor bursts forth. It shows up in maybe 40 poems. He was really marked by that disastrous sea voyage he took in 1841. Supposed to go to India, ended up shipwrecked near Mauritius.
He hated the trip, apparently.
Hated it, yes. But it seared these sensations into his memory, colors, smells, sounds of the tropics and the ocean. He used them constantly.
So what does the sea represent?
On the positive side, escape, a lost golden age, richness, love, freedom, feeling uplifted, purified, consoled, finding oblivion in its vastness.
And the negative?
Sadness, limitation, hostility, the darkness of the unknown, maybe the afterlife. His poems are full of sea imagery, ships, rigging, captains, storms, the albatross, shipwreck. It perfectly captures his duality. The sea can mean enchantment or despair.
Moving outwards again, exotism. The source calls him an inner traveler.
Yeah, a traveler in his room, mostly.
Yeah.
That sea voyage was one source, but he also drew inspiration from art. He mentions Dutch painters in Invitation to the Voyage.
So how does this exotism show up?
Through places the Orient, India, Africa, the tropics, or through time looking back at past eras, or just through evocative hints and suggestions.
And there was that interesting point about reverse exoticism.
Yes, this is really quite touching and unusual for his time. He writes about women from the tropics who've been brought to France, like the Creole lady or the Malabarese lady.
And he portrays their experience.
He does. They're admired for their exotic looks, but they're suffering. Homesick, missing their warmer climate, finding France harsh and alien. He uses this image of absent coconut trees twice. It shows this surprising empathy for these displaced people.
That adds a really human dimension. Okay, finally, the figure of the poet himself in the poems.
The poet shows up in about 20 poems. Sometimes his calling is presented strongly, but often it's a less glamorous picture. The poet is trapped by the world, awkward, unable to fit in like the albatross, clumsy on deck but graceful in the sky.
Sounds like he felt misunderstood.
Very much so. He's portrayed as solitary, an enemy of families, poor, powerless, lost. It's hard not to see Baudelaire's own struggles reflected there.
Definitely feels autobiographical. So let's try and pull this together. We've gone through the stormy history of Les Fleurs du Mal, its publication, the trial, the censorship, its eventual rehabilitation. We've seen its deliberate structure like a journey.
From spleen towards an ideal, through failed escapes like the city, wine, or dark beauty, leading to revolt and finally death.
And we've explored these huge, complex themes woven throughout. The crushing spleen, the physical reality of death, the contradictory woman, symbolic animals, a deeply conflicted faith, the potential and peril of correspondences, the ambivalent sea, exotism, and the struggling poet.
It's such a landmark work because he just didn't look away from the darkness. He deliberately sought beauty, or at least poetic material, in places people found ugly or disturbing urban grime. complex desires, death, suffering, evil itself. That core idea, extracting beauty from evil, that was revolutionary.
And that struggle he portrays, trying to reconcile the ideal and the real, beauty and evil, the sacred and the profane, it still feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it, in our own complex, often contradictory world?
Absolutely.
So the provocative thought we want to leave you with is this. Baudelaire found his subject matter in the uncomfortable, sometimes ugly realities of life and the human mind. What flowers, what unexpected beauty or insight might you find if you look closely at the seemingly difficult or unpleasant corners of your own experience or the source material you engage with? What can be extracted from what initially looks like just Mao? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling forensic science.
Right.
You probably picture, crime scene tape, maybe lab coats.
Mm-hmm.
The usual image.
And yeah, that's part of it, but we want to go a bit deeper. Forensic science is fundamentally about applying scientific principles, methods, to legal questions.
Both criminal and civil cases, yeah.
Exactly. People often mix it up with criminalistics, but forensic science is really the bigger umbrella term. Covers a lot of ground.
It really does. And for this deep dive, you've given us a pretty comprehensive source, the Wikipedia page on forensic science.
Right.
So our mission today is to, dig into all that info, pull out the key historical bits, the really significant techniques, and maybe touch on some of the current debates around it.
Kind of a shortcut, then, to understanding its evolution and impact.
Exactly. Your shortcut.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning. The word forensic. It sounds quite, technical.
Well, what's interesting is where it comes from. It's actually from Latin, the word forensis.
Forensis.
Yeah, meaning of a forum, a place of assembly.
Oh, like the Roman Forum, where
Sure.
people would gather and debate.
Precisely that. Back in Roman times, you'd present your legal case pretty much in a public forum.
So you argue your side, the other person argues theirs.
And often the most persuasive argument won. So that connection to presenting legal evidence, publicly, that's the root.
Ah, okay.
And you're right, we often just say forensics now, interchangeably with forensic science.
That makes a lot more sense now. Presenting knowledge.
Yeah.
Scientifically gain knowledge in a legal forum.
Mm-hmm.
Because science is just, it's a systematic way to get knowledge.
Exactly. So forensic science brings that system, that way of thinking, into crime solving and legal matters.
Okay. So the ancient world, they didn't have CSI labs back then, obviously.
No, not quite. For a long, long time, things really relied heavily on confessions, maybe eyewitness accounts.
Which we know can be unreliable.
Very unreliable. But what's fascinating is you can still find these early hints, these seeds of what we now call forensic thinking.
Even without the formal methods.
Absolutely. A really key early example is from China, 1248, a book called Shi Yuan Lu,
Shi Yuan Lu.
or Washing Away of Wrongs, written by Song Shi. And this is basically considered the first time someone wrote down how to use medicine and, get this, entomology, the study of insects in crime investigations.
Wow, 1248, that's incredibly early. What was in it?
It was surprisingly detailed for its era. It laid out guidelines for autopsy reports, stressed how important it was to, protect the evidence during the examination,
Okay.
and even said the examiner needed to be impartial. Really forward-thinking.
Yeah, impartiality is key.
And they had methods, like using antiseptics, and ways to reveal hidden injuries on bodies or bones using sunlight and vinegar.
Sunlight and vinegar, how does that work?
Well, the idea was to bring out subtle marks, bruises maybe, that weren't obvious. They even specified doing it under a red oil umbrella.
A red oil umbrella, that's specific. Any idea why?
Likely to control the light, maybe cut glare. To get a clearer view of those subtle injuries, they also worked out ways to estimate time of death.
How?
By looking at the weather, insect activity on the body, stuff like that. The book described how to tell drowning from strangulation, for example.
So differentiating causes of death.
Right, and trying to determine if it was murder, suicide, or just an accident. It was really a practical guide.
I'm amazed.
There's this one incredible case described, a murder with a sickle.
Okay.
The investigator couldn't figure out who did it. So he had all the suspects lay their sickles out. Flies. Flies were attracted to the tiny, invisible traces of blood on the actual murder weapon. They swarmed it.
No way.
Yeah, the owner confessed right then and there. Talk about letting nature point the finger.
That is an incredible story. Early forensic observation in action.
And it wasn't just China. You see similar ideas elsewhere. Ancient India, China again, the Middle East. They used things like saliva.
Saliva. How could saliva tell you anything forensically back then?
Well, the thinking was, and there's actually a physiological basis to this, that guilt causes anxiety.
Okay, dry mouth.
Exactly. Less saliva. So in India, suspects might chew dried rice and spit it out. If lots of rice stuck, maybe they were guilty. Dry mouth. China used rice powder similarly. In the Middle East, there's talk of licking a hot metal rod briefly.
Ouch.
Yeah. The idea was a guilty person with less saliva would get burned worse. Now, obviously, these aren't scientific tests by our standards.
Oh, not exactly rigorous.
But you can see them as sort of precursors to modern polygraphs, trying to measure a physiological response linked to stress or deception.
It's fascinating connecting physical reactions to guilt so early on. Okay, so jumping ahead, how did these early ideas start to form into a more formal field?
Right, so moving into the 16th century in Europe, you start seeing medical practitioners really looking closely at causes of death, especially army surgeons, university types.
Like Ambroise Paré.
Exactly, the French army surgeon. He documented the effects of violent death on internal organs. And later, to Italian surgeons, Fortunato Fidelis and Polizzacchia, they really laid more groundwork for modern pathology, studying changes in the body from disease.
So it started very much on the medical anatomical side.
Yeah, that seems to be the core early on. And by the late 18th century, you get actual books dedicated to it. Forderé's treatise on forensic medicine and public health. Johann Peter Frank's Complete System of Police Medicine.
Okay, so it's becoming a defined area of study.
And this is around the Enlightenment period, right? So there's this bigger shift happening, more emphasis on evidence-based investigation.
Moving away from torture for confessions, superstition.
Exactly. A move towards finding answers, not forcing them. And you see it reflected in actual court cases in England around then.
Like what? Any examples?
Yeah, there's one from 1784 in Lancaster. John Toms, convicted of murder.
How?
A pistol wad, like the paper or cloth used to pack the gunpowder, was found in the victim's head wound.
Yeah.
And it perfectly matched a torn piece of newspaper found in Tom's pocket.
Wow, a direct physical match.
A direct physical link. Then 1816, Warwick, a maidservant murdered. They solved it using a combination of things. Footprints near the pond where she was found. An impression left by corduroy claw that had a specific patch on it, found nearby, and even scattered wheat grains.
Wheat grains?
Yeah, they matched grains on the trousers of a local farm laborer who'd been threshing wheat nearby. All those little details together pointed to him.
That's incredibly detailed observation for the early 1800s.
It really is. It shows this growing awareness that even tiny bits of physical stuff could be crucial evidence. And then by 1885, you even see an article in Scientific American
About
using microscopy to tell the difference between the blood of two different people in a case in Chicago. So scientific tools are starting to be applied more directly.
which naturally leads to developing specific techniques, right? Where should we start there? Chromatography.
Yeah, chromatography is a really foundational one. It's basically a way to separate out the different components in a mixture.
Okay. Why is that so important in forensics?
Well, think about trace evidence. Tiny amounts of liquids, maybe drugs, biological samples. Chromatography lets you isolate and identify the different substances present. Things like GCMS gas, chromatography mass spectrometry, are workhorses in forensic labs today.
Like a super sensitive chemical analysis tool.
Pretty much, yeah. It can identify unique chemical fingerprints, even from tiny samples, really quickly and reliably. Essential for drug analysis, arson investigations, looking for accelerants, that kind of thing.
Makes sense. What about poisons? That seems like another classic area.
Absolutely. Toxicology detecting poisons has a long history, too. Carl Wilhelm Scheele, back in 1773, figured out how to detect arsenic in bodies.
Arsenic, the classic poison.
Right. And Valentin Ross later improved on that, finding it in stomach walls. But a really, really key moment came with James Marsh.
Okay.
He was a chemist involved in an 1832 murder trial. The accused was thought to have poisoned his grandfather with arsenic.
And Marsh tested for it.
He did. Using the standard test of the time, it produced this yellow precipitate, arsenic trisulfide. But the problem was, by the time it got to the jury, the sample had degraded.
Oh, no. So doubt was created.
Exactly. Led to an acquittal. Marsh was apparently really frustrated, so he went back and developed a much better test.
Yeah.
Way more sensitive, way more stable.
What did his test involve?
It involved mixing the sample with sulfuric acid and zinc that was free of arsenic. This created arsine gas.
Okay.
Then you ignite the gas and pass it over a cold surface. If arsenic was present, it left this very distinct silvery black metallic deposit.
Ah, a clear visual
A
indicator.
very clear, stable indicator. It became known as the Marsh test after he published it in 1836. It could detect unbelievably small amounts of arsenic.
So that really revolutionized arsenic poisoning cases.
Absolutely. It gave them a reliable, demonstrable scientific method. Then you have ballistics, firearms examination.
Matching bullets to guns.
Essentially, yeah. Looking at the unique markings left on bullets as they travel down the barrel, and on cartridge casings from the firing pin and other parts of the gun.
Microscopic scratches and indentations.
Exactly. Comparing those unique marks can help link a bullet or casing back to a specific weapon.
When did that start getting developed?
Some of the early work is credited to Henry Goddard at Scotland Yard around 1835. He noticed a specific flaw on a bullet from a crime scene.
A manufacturing flaw.
Yeah, and he was able to trace it back to the specific mold used to make that bullet. An early example of linking a projectile to a source.
Fascinating. Okay, identifying people. Obviously crucial. Before DNA, what were the main ways?
Well, a big step forward was anthropometry. Basically, a system of physical measurements.
Developed by?
Alphonse Bertillon, French police officer, late 19th century. Before him, identifying criminals was mostly by name or photo. Not very reliable, especially with repeat offenders using aliases.
Right. Easy to lie about your name.
So Bertillon developed this detailed system, measuring head width, forearm length, foot size, all sorts of things.
The idea being that these measurements were unique.
His belief was they were unique to each person and wouldn't really change much after adulthood. It became known as the Bertillon system, or Bertillonage.
Did it work?
It was used for a while, but fingerprinting eventually proved much more reliable and practical. But Bertillon contributed a lot elsewhere too. Document examination, preserving footprints, early ballistics work, crime scene photography.
The mugshot. Was that him?
That was Bertillon's innovation, yeah. Standardized photos, front and profile, still used today.
Okay, so anthropometry was a step, but then came fingerprints. That's the big one most people know.
Definitely. Fingerprinting really started gaining steam in the late 1800s. Sir William Herschel, working in India for the British Civil Service from 1858.
What did he do?
He started using thumbprints on contracts, just as a way to stop people denying their signatures later. Then on pension payments, he noticed they seemed unique and didn't change.
Just a practical measure initially.
Pretty much. Then, in 1880, Henry Faulds, a Scottish surgeon in Japan, published an article in Nature. He talked about fingerprint uniqueness and suggested they could be used for identification.
So Faulds saw the forensic potential.
Yes. He even proposed using ink to record them, and apparently was the first to identify fingerprints left on something at a crime scene.
Did the police jump on it?
Faulds told the London Metropolitan Police, but they didn't really bite at first. He also wrote to Charles Darwin about it.
Darwin.
Yeah, but Darwin was ill, so he passed it on to his cousin, Francis Galton.
The famous statistician and anthropologist?
That's the one. Galton got really interested and spent about 10 years studying fingerprints. He published a book, Fingerprints.
What was the key takeaway?
He developed a statistical model showing just how incredibly unlikely it was for two people to have the same fingerprints. That really boosted the scientific credibility.
So the statistics made a strong case.
Hugely influential. Around the same time, over in Argentina, a police officer named Juan Vutetich developed the first workable system for classifying and filing fingerprints.
A practical system.
Exactly. He set up the world's first fingerprint bureau in 1892. And that same year, a really important case happened. Francisca Rojas.
What was that case?
She'd accused her neighbor of murdering her two sons, but the neighbor denied it. Vutetich's colleague found a bloody thumbprint on a door.
And it matched.
It matched Rojas herself, she confessed. First homicide solved using fingerprints.
Wow, that must have made waves.
It did. And adoption started to spread. 1897, a fingerprint bureau in Calcutta, India. Big contributions there from two Indian experts, Azuzul Haq and Hemchandra Bose.
Okay.
They're instrumental in developing the Henry classification system, named after their boss, Sir Edward Richard Henry.
The Henry system, I've heard of that.
It became the standard. Adopted in England and Wales in 1901, Scotland Yard set up their bureau. Then the U.S. followed. New York Civil Service used it in 1902, NYPD officially in 1905.
It's interesting how it developed in different places, but then converged on a standard system. Now, the source also mentions something called the Uhlenhuth test.
Right, the Uhlenhuth test, developed by Paul Uhlenhuth, German immunologist, around 1901. This was a massive breakthrough for distinguishing human blood from animal blood.
How did it work?
It's based on immunology. Antigen-antibody reactions, like how our bodies make antibodies against foreign stuff.
Okay.
If you inject, say, human blood proteins into a rabbit, the rabbit makes antibodies specifically against human proteins. Uhlenhuth used this. He developed a serum containing these antibodies.
So you could test a blood stain.
Exactly. Add the serum. If it clumped up, reacted, it meant human protein was present. It confirmed the sample was human blood. Incredibly important for blood evidence analysis.
Yeah, that would be vital. Distinguishing animal blood from human blood at a scene, and then the game changer, DNA.
The absolute game changer. Developed by Sir Alec Jeffreys in 1984, he discovered variations in our DNA could create a unique genetic profile, a DNA fingerprint.
And the first case?
The Narborough double murder case in England, 1985. 2 young girls raped and murdered. A local man actually confessed to one of the murders.
Right.
But DNA analysis, Jeffreys' technique, proved he didn't commit either crime. The semen samples from both scenes matched each other, but not the man who confessed.
So the first DNA exoneration right there.
Exactly. A powerful demonstration right off the bat.
How did they find the real killer then?
The police did something unprecedented.
Hmm?
A voluntary mass DNA screening. Thousands of men in the area gave blood or saliva samples.
Wow.
Eventually, a tip led them to Colin Pitchfork. His DNA matched the crime scene samples. He was convicted.
That case really launched DNA forensics, didn't it?
Absolutely. It showed the incredible power of the technique and led directly to the idea of creating national DNA databases, like CODIS in the U.S., which are now vital tools.
Okay, so by the turn of the 20th century, forensic science is really becoming established.
Definitely. You even see it in earlier complex cases like Jack the Ripper in the 1880s.
Even though that was never solved.
Right, but the approach showed progress. Police did massive house-to-house inquiries. They collected and looked at evidence from the scenes, tried to trace suspects. They even got a police surgeon, Thomas Bond, to examine the victims and give an opinion. Basically, the earliest example of an offender profile.
Using the crime details to try and understand the perpetrator.
Exactly. Careful observation, logical thinking, even without all the tech we have now.
And around this time, Sherlock Holmes appears on the scene.
Right. Arthur Conan Doyle's creation. Holmes, with his focus on tiny details, trace evidence, deduction, he massively popularized the idea of forensic analysis.
Did he influence the real thing?
He certainly captured the public imagination and probably inspired investigators to look closer. He even foreshadowed some techniques that weren't really developed yet.
So fiction kind of nudged reality along a bit.
In a way. But the real heavy lifting was done by key figures. Hans Gross, an Austrian jurist. His handbook for coroners in 1893 is seen as foundational for criminalistics.
What did he emphasize?
Integrating different fields, psychology, physical science, and documenting crime scenes properly, using photography.
Okay. Who else?
Archibald Rice. He started the very first dedicated school of forensic science, University of Lausanne, Switzerland, 1909.
A formal place to learn this stuff.
Exactly. And Edmond Locard in France, often called the French Sherlock Holmes.
Locard's exchange principle.
That's him. Every contact leaves a trace. Such a core concept. He started one of the world's first proper crime labs in Lyon around 1910.
That principle is still fundamental, isn't it?
Absolutely. Others were crucial too. Alexander Lacassagne set autopsy standards, Bertillon we mentioned, Joseph Thomas Walker developed modern techniques, published a lot, and Frances Glessner Lee.
The mother of forensic science.
In the U.S., yes. She pushed hard for medical examiners instead of elected coroners, founded the Harvard Associates in Police Science, and her nutshell studies.
The miniature crime scenes.
Incredibly detailed dioramas, still used for training investigators today. Amazing work.
It really feels like that period, late 19th, early 20th century, was when it all came together and got formalized.
It absolutely was. The 20th century saw more development. British pathologists made big contributions. National and international organizations popped up, helping standardize things.
And now in the 21st century.
More tech. Laser scanners for scenes, drones, photogrammetry to create super accurate 3D models of crime scenes. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is heavily involved in developing standards for all this new tech.
The field just keeps evolving.
Yeah.
The Wikipedia entry also lists a huge number of subdivisions. It's not just one thing, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It's incredibly specialized now. You've got art forensics figuring out if a painting is fake, wildlife forensics investigating poaching or illegal trade,
Okay.
blood stain pattern analysis, digital forensics for phones and computers, forensic anthropology for bones, forensic toxicology for drugs and poisons. The list just goes on and on.
So many niche areas requiring deep expertise.
Exactly. Each needs specific scientific knowledge and techniques.
But with all these techniques, have some fallen out of favor or been proven unreliable.
That's a really crucial point. Forensic science isn't perfect. Techniques get adopted, and sometimes later the science behind them gets questioned or even disproven.
Like what?
A big one was comparative bullet lead analysis. The FBI used it for decades.
The idea being?
That the chemical makeup of lead in bullets was unique to each batch. So you could link a bullet fragment to a specific box of ammo, maybe. But later research showed actually different batches could be chemically very similar. And composition could vary even within the same batch. The potential for error for false matches was too high.
So the FBI stopped using it?
Yeah, they abandoned it completely in 2005.
That's pretty significant. Any other areas under scrutiny?
Forensic dentistry, particularly bite mark comparisons.
Trying to match bite marks on a victim to a suspect's teeth?
Exactly. This has faced a lot of criticism. There have been high-profile wrongful convictions based on bite marks, later overturned by DNA.
Why is it so problematic?
Studies show high error rates. There's just not a strong scientific foundation proving that bite marks are unique enough or that skin records them reliably enough for positive identification. It's still used sometimes, but it's very controversial.
And then there's the whole privacy issue with genetic databases, right?
Yeah, a huge issue, especially with genetic genealogy databases, the ones people use for ancestry research, like Ancestry DNA or 23andMe.
We're using those now.
Yes, to try and identify suspects in cold cases by finding distant relatives in these databases and building family trees. It's been successful in some famous cases.
But the privacy concern is?
Well, people uploaded their DNA for genealogy, not for law enforcement scrutiny. It raises questions about consent, about the privacy of not just the person who uploaded, but all their relatives too. Where do you draw the line? The FBI's CODIS database is different. That's profiles from convicted offenders. But genealogy databases cast a much wider net.
It's a tricky balance between solving crimes and individual privacy.
Definitely an ongoing debate.
The term litigation science also popped up in the source. What's that about?
Litigation science. That's basically scientific analysis done specifically for a trial, as opposed to, say, research done for general scientific publication.
Why is that distinction important?
A U.S. court, the Ninth Circuit, highlighted it. The concern is that science done purely for litigation might be, well, biased, tailored to support one side's legal argument, rather than being purely objective scientific inquiry.
Okay, so wanting to ensure the science presented in court is as objective as possible. Got it. Let's shift slightly demographics and media. How many people work in this field?
The estimate for 2025 was around 18,500 forensic science technicians in the U.S.
And the media impact, the CSI effect.
Right, the CSI effect. It's a well-documented thing. TV shows like CSI portray forensic science as incredibly fast, always conclusive, maybe even a bit glamorous.
Which isn't quite reality.
Not usually, no.
Yeah.
Real forensic work is often slow, painstaking, methodical. Lab results take time. Evidence isn't always perfect or definitive.
And the CSI effect actually impacts real trials.
Research suggests it can, yeah. Jurors who watch these shows might come in with unrealistic expectations. They might expect mountains of high-tech forensic evidence for every single case.
And if they don't get it?
They might be less likely to convict, even if other evidence is strong. It can potentially create a bias if the real-world evidence doesn't live up to the TV drama. People have even talked about screening jurors about their viewing habits.
Wow, but media can be positive too.
Yeah, the flip side is, some studies suggest newspaper coverage of science and tech can actually boost public perception and interest in fields like forensic science. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
More awareness, but potentially skewed expectations. Okay, let's talk controversies and challenges. The field isn't without its problems.
No field is, and it's crucial to acknowledge them. There are fundamental questions being asked about even long-standing techniques, like fingerprints.
We assume they're unique, right?
We operate on that assumption, and statistically, it's incredibly likely. But has it been proven unique for every single person on Earth to the kind of rigorous scientific standard we demand today? Some argue maybe not quite. That kind of questioning is healthy, though.
Pushing for better validation.
Exactly. And there are definite issues with lack of standardization and quality control across different labs and different disciplines within forensics.
Has that led to actual problems, miscarriages of justice?
Absolutely, unfortunately. There was a big Supreme Court case, Melendez-Diaz v. Massachusetts in 2009. It said forensic analysts who write lab reports have to be available in court for cross-examination.
Why was that necessary?
Partly because organizations like the National Academy of Sciences had raised red flags about potential errors, bias, lack of rigorous standards in some forensic work. And the fact that not all crime labs in the U.S. have to be accredited, that's led to major scandals. The Houston Police Department lab issues were a huge wake-up call. Bad science, bad evidence handling, leading to wrongful convictions.
And the Innocence Project often highlights forensic science issues in exoneration cases.
Tragically, yes. If you look at their data on DNA exonerations, faulty forensic science, not DNA, but things like hair analysis, bite marks, shoe prints before methods were fully validated, has been a contributing factor in a significant chunk of wrongful convictions.
Why do these errors happen?
Sometimes it's the technique itself lacking validation. Sometimes it's human error or interpretation. And there's the issue of forensic confirmation bias.
Meaning?
Examiners might unconsciously interpret ambiguous data in a way that confirms what investigators already believe about a suspect. Context can influence perception.
So the field is actively grappling with these issues.
Yes, there's a lot more focus now on validation, standards, minimizing bias, understanding limitations. It's an ongoing process. And one more point from the source, potential racial bias.
In what way?
Concerns have been raised about whether things like reporting of rape-related injuries or even the sensitivity of examination techniques might vary based on the race of the victim or examiner. That needs serious attention too.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's touch on the humanitarian side. Forensic science isn't just about crime.
Not at all. This is incredibly important work. Think about the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC. They use forensic experts, anthropologists, DNA specialists to help identify missing persons after wars, disasters, migration crises.
Like giving answers to families.
Exactly. Providing identification, confirmation of what happened. It's vital for grieving, for closure. Organizations like the Argentine Forensic Anthropology Team or the International Commission on Missing Persons, ICMP, they do amazing work excavating mass graves, identifying victims of atrocities, using forensic science for human rights.
And the Minnesota Protocol.
That provides international standards, best practices for investigating suspicious deaths, potentially unlawful killings. It really emphasizes the role of forensic science in accountability and justice on a global scale.
It's a powerful reminder of the broader impact. Well, this has been a really thorough exploration. We've gone from ancient China and Roman forums right up to DNA databases, laser scanners, and these really complex ethical and scientific debates.
Yeah, it's quite a journey. From, pretty basic observations and ideas to incredibly sophisticated science. And the key thing is it's still evolving, still being scrutinized.
That process of refinement, of questioning assumptions, seems so vital for a field with this much impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. Seeing how it constantly has to self-assess, grapple with limitations. It's what science should do, especially when the stakes are this high. That journey from intuition to rigorous analysis is long, and like you said, it's definitely not over.
So thinking about how much we rely on forensic evidence now in our legal systems, it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How do we make absolutely sure the methods are scientifically solid, that they're used ethically, interpreted fairly, to keep trust in the whole system?
And what's our role as the public in understanding these complexities, in demanding that rigor?
Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive.